The sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow over the streets as people hurried home. In the heart of downtown stood a high-end car dealership, its glass windows gleaming under the evening lights. Inside, salespeople in crisp suits chatted with well-dressed clients, the smell of leather and polish filling the air. A man walked in, dressed in simple jeans and a plain t-shirt, his sneakers slightly worn. He wasn't what the staff expected to see in a place that sold luxury cars. His dark skin and casual outfit made him stand out among the polished customers. He moved slowly, looking at the cars with genuine interest, his fingers lightly brushing over the hood of a sleek black sedan. One of the salesmen, a tall guy with slicked back hair, eyed him with suspicion. He nudged his coworker. "You think he's just here to take pictures?" The other salesman smirked. "Probably. No way he can afford any of these." The man didn't seem to notice their whispers. He stopped near a sports car, admiring its curves. The tall salesman decided to approach, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "Can I help you with something, sir?" The man smiled. "Just looking around. This model's got a nice engine." The salesman raised an eyebrow. "Oh? You know about cars?" "Yeah, a bit," the man replied casually. The salesman's smile tightened. "Well, these are very expensive. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at a used lot down the street." The man's smile didn't fade, but his eyes sharpened. "I'm fine here, thanks." The salesman crossed his arms. "Listen, we don't want any trouble. If you're not serious about buying, you should leave." A few customers nearby had stopped to watch. The man sighed, then reached into his pocket. The salesman tensed, but instead of pulling out a wallet, the man took out a phone. He dialed a number, put it on speaker, and waited. A voice answered. "Mr. Johnson. We've been expecting your call. The paperwork is ready whenever you are." The salesman's face went pale. "Johnson? As in, the new owner?" The man, Mr. Johnson, smiled. "Thanks. I'm at the dealership now. Seems there's a bit of confusion." The salesman's mouth went dry. The other staff members froze. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Mr. Johnson ended the call and looked at the salesman. "So," he said calmly, "you were saying something about me leaving?" The dealership fell silent. The salesman's mouth opened, but no words came out. His face flushed red, then pale, like he was caught between panic and disbelief. The other employees exchanged nervous glances, some looked down at their shoes, others pretended to be busy. The customers who had been watching now whispered among themselves. Mr. Johnson slid his phone back into his pocket, still calm. He glanced around the showroom, taking in the expensive cars, the polished floors, the uneasy staff. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not gloating, just observing. The salesman finally found his voice. I didn't realize." "You didn't ask," Mr. Johnson said simply. A well-dressed woman in the back, probably the manager, rushed forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Mr. Johnson. Welcome. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." Her smile was wide, but her eyes darted to the salesman, flashing a warning. Mr. Johnson nodded at her. "Decided to stop by early. Wanted to see the place without the formalities." The manager laughed nervously. "Of course. Let me give you a proper tour." And, she turned to the salesman, her voice turning icy. "A word in my office. Now." The salesman swallowed hard and followed her, shoulders hunched like a scolded child. The remaining staff straightened up, suddenly eager to appear professional. One younger employee, a nervous-looking guy with glasses, stepped forward. Mr. Johnson, can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" Mr. Johnson smiled, a real one this time. Coffee would be great. Black, no sugar. The employee nodded and hurried off. Meanwhile, the whispers among the customers grew louder. A middle-aged man in a suit leaned toward his wife. "Did you hear that? That's the new owner." His wife shook her head. "And they tried to kick him out? Unbelievable." Mr. Johnson pretended not to hear. He walked over to the sports car he had been admiring earlier and ran his hand along its hood again. "Beautiful machine," he murmured. The young employee returned with the coffee, hands slightly shaky. "Here you go, sir." "Thanks," Mr. Johnson said, taking the cup. He sipped it, then glanced at the employee's name tag. "You new here?" The employee nodded. "Third week, sir." Mr. Johnson studied him for a moment. "You like cars?" The employee's face lit up. "Love them. Been working on my dad's old Chevy since I was a kid." A genuine grin spread across Mr. Johnson's face. "Good. Passion's important in this business." Before they could talk more, the manager returned, her smile strained. The salesman wasn't with her. "Mr. Johnson, I deeply apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. That employee has been dealt with." Mr. Johnson's smile faded. He set his coffee down. "Fired?" The manager hesitated. "Well, I'd like to talk to him," Mr. Johnson said. The manager blinked. "Sir?" "Before any decisions are made," he continued, his voice firm but not unkind. "Bring him back out here." The manager hesitated, then nodded and walked off. The young employee beside Mr. Johnson looked surprised. The customers nearby had stopped pretending not to listen, now they were fully invested in the drama unfolding. A minute later, the salesman returned, his face tight with humiliation. He couldn't meet Mr. Johnson's eyes. Mr. Johnson crossed his arms. "Look at me." The salesman forced himself to lift his gaze. "You judged me the second I walked in," Mr. Johnson said. "Why?" The salesman opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew any excuse would sound weak. Mr. Johnson sighed. "This place sells luxury, but that doesn't mean you treat people like they don't belong. You lost a sale today. Could have lost more if I were just a regular customer." The salesman's shoulders slumped. I messed up." "Yeah, you did," Mr. Johnson said. Then, to everyone's surprise, he added, "But you get one chance to fix it." The manager's eyes widened. The salesman stared, unsure if he'd heard right. Mr. Johnson picked up his coffee again. "Starting tomorrow, you're on probation. You'll attend sensitivity training. And you'll earn your place here, no shortcuts." He took a sip, then added, "If you want it." The salesman's throat worked. After a long pause, he nodded. "I do." Mr. Johnson gave a small, satisfied nod. Then he turned to the manager. "Now, let's talk about this quarter's numbers." And just like that, the tension in the room shifted. The staff exchanged glances, some relieved, some impressed. The customers, now smiling, went back to browsing, though they kept stealing glances at the new boss. The young employee with glasses let out a quiet breath. Maybe this place was about to change. And maybe, for the better. The dealership hummed with nervous energy as Mr. Johnson followed the manager toward her office. Employees pretended to focus on work, but their eyes kept darting toward him. The salesman who tried to kick him out lingered awkwardly near the coffee machine, gripping a cup like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Inside the office, the manager, Ms. Carter, gestured for Mr. Johnson to take a seat. Her hands fluttered slightly as she arranged papers on her desk. "Again, Mr. Johnson, I can't apologize enough for what happened. I assure you, that kind of behavior isn't tolerated here." Mr. Johnson studied her for a moment before sitting. "Is that right?" Ms. Carter froze mid-motion. Of course. Then why did it happen today? His voice wasn't accusing, just curious. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The truth was obvious. No one had stopped the salesman because no one had expected a man who looked like Mr. Johnson to be the boss. Mr. Johnson leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Here's what I think. This place looks successful on paper, but there's a culture problem. You've got employees judging customers, and probably each other, based on appearances. Ms. Carter's face tightened. With all due respect, sir, our sales numbers are good. But they could be better. Mr. Johnson pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. I did some research before buying this place. You've lost at least 3 major clients this year to competitors. Know why? Ms. Carter stayed silent. Because people talk, he continued. And word gets around about which businesses make you feel welcome, and which ones don't. A knock at the door interrupted them. The young employee from earlier, the one who'd brought coffee, peeked in hesitantly. Sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Johnson, your assistant just called. Said it's urgent? Mr. Johnson stood. We'll continue this later. As he walked out, Ms. Carter slumped slightly in her chair. Outside, the showroom had returned to its usual rhythm, except now, every employee stood a little straighter when Mr. Johnson passed by. The young employee followed him. Sir? I didn't actually get a call from your assistant. You just looked like you needed an out. Mr. Johnson stopped walking and turned, eyebrows raised. Then he chuckled. What's your name? Daniel, sir. Daniel. Mr. Johnson nodded, committing it to memory. You've got good instincts. How'd you end up fetching coffee here? Daniel shrugged. Needed a job. Love cars. Figured I'd work my way up. Mr. Johnson studied him for a long moment. Then he made a decision. How'd you like to work your way up faster? I need someone who understands this place but isn't part of the old guard. Daniel's eyes widened. You mean? Starting tomorrow, you're my shadow. Learn fast, and there'll be more responsibility coming. Mr. Johnson glanced at his watch. Right now, I need to see the service department. Lead the way. As they walked, Daniel's mind raced. This morning he'd been the new guy nobody noticed. Now he was assistant to the boss who'd turned the whole dealership upside down in an hour. The service bay was a different world, grease-stained floors, the smell of oil, mechanics in coveralls bent over engines. Conversation died as Mr. Johnson entered. A burly man with salt and pepper hair wiped his hands on a rag and approached. Help you? Mr. Johnson extended a hand. Just introducing myself. I'm the new owner. The mechanic's grip was firm, his eyes wary. Tony. Service manager. Good to meet you, Tony. Mr. Johnson looked around. Mind giving me a tour? As Tony showed him around, Mr. Johnson asked sharp questions, about workflow, part suppliers, customer complaints. The mechanics slowly warmed up when they realized he actually understood their work. One young tech was struggling with a tricky engine issue. Mr. Johnson rolled up his sleeves. Mind if I take a look? The tech blinked but stepped aside. Within minutes, Mr. Johnson had diagnosed the problem. Your timing's off. Here, he grabbed a tool and made a quick adjustment. Try it now. The engine purred to life perfectly. The mechanics exchanged impressed glances. Tony crossed his arms. You know your way around an engine. Started as a mechanic, Mr. Johnson said simply. Worked my way through school fixing cars. Something shifted in the room. These men respected skill more than suits. One of the older mechanics grinned. Well, I'll be damned. A boss who actually gets his hands dirty. Mr. Johnson smiled. Get used to it. As he and Daniel left the service bay, Daniel couldn't contain his curiosity. You really were a mechanic? Still am, in my garage at home. Mr. Johnson's phone buzzed. He checked it and sighed. Looks like we've got our first crisis. A client's threatening to cancel a 6-fleet order because their last delivery was late. Daniel hesitated. What are you going to do? Mr. Johnson headed for the door. Fix it. Come on, time for your first real lesson in leadership. As they stepped into the afternoon sun, Daniel realized something. The employees inside were still whispering about the new boss. But now, the whispers sounded different. Less nervous. Almost hopeful. The client's office was in a sleek high-rise downtown, all glass walls and expensive artwork. As the elevator climbed, Daniel fidgeted with his tie, borrowed from the dealership's Lost and Found, while Mr. Johnson stood perfectly calm, studying a file on his phone. You ever handled something like this before? Daniel asked. Mr. Johnson didn't look up. Every crisis feels big until you solve it. Then it's just another story. The elevator doors opened to reveal a waiting area where a stern-looking receptionist eyed their casual attire. Mr. Langley is expecting you, she said coldly. The office beyond was all power, dark wood, leather chairs, and a broad-shouldered man in his 50s standing by the window, back turned as he talked angrily into his phone. Unacceptable from a so-called premium supplier. I don't care what their excuse, he turned and saw them. We'll finish this later. Hanging up, he gestured to chairs. Sit. Mr. Johnson remained standing. Mr. Langley, I understand you're upset about the fleet delivery. Upset? Langley's face reddened. 3 of my executives were left without vehicles for a week because your people can't read a calendar. Daniel held his breath, but Mr. Johnson just nodded. You're right. That shouldn't have happened. Langley blinked, thrown off by the agreement. Damn right it shouldn't have. Mr. Johnson set a folder on the desk. Here's what I propose: free upgrades to the executive models for 12 months, priority servicing at your offices, and my personal guarantee it won't happen again. Langley opened the folder, scanning the terms. This is generous. It's fair. Mr. Johnson met his gaze. But I need something from you. Langley's eyes narrowed. What? Tell me why you almost walked away. The real reason. The room went quiet. Langley leaned back, studying this unexpected businessman in jeans and a t-shirt. Finally, he sighed. Your last manager made promises he didn't keep. Every meeting was excuses. Mr. Johnson nodded. Not anymore. My number's in that file. Call me directly if anything goes wrong. Langley tapped the papers thoughtfully. You're new. Started today. A slow smile spread across Langley's face. Well then, welcome to the neighborhood. He extended his hand. Back in the elevator, Daniel exhaled sharply. That was incredible. He was ready to destroy us. Mr. Johnson pocketed his phone. People don't want apologies. They want to be heard, and to know it won't happen again. As they stepped into the parking garage, Daniel hesitated. Can I ask, why'd you bring me? Mr. Johnson unlocked a modest sedan, not one of their luxury models. 2 reasons. First, everyone deserves to see how real business gets done. He started the engine. Second, I needed a witness. For what? In case I failed. Mr. Johnson pulled into traffic. Leaders fall sometimes. What matters is getting back up. Daniel sat with that as the city blurred past. At a red light, Mr. Johnson's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. Problem? Daniel asked. Ms. Carter just resigned. The light turned green. Mr. Johnson accelerated smoothly. Looks like we're making changes sooner than I thought. The dealership parking lot was nearly empty when they returned, the evening sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. Through the glass walls, they could see the remaining staff huddled near the reception desk, their body language tense even from a distance. Daniel cleared his throat. So, what happens now? Mr. Johnson turned off the engine but didn't immediately move. First rule of leadership, Daniel: when someone leaves, you thank them for their service before asking why. Inside, the employees scattered like startled birds when the doors opened. Only Ms. Carter remained at her desk, packing framed photos into a cardboard box. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but composed. "You didn't have to rush back," she said. Mr. Johnson pulled up a chair. "Tell me what changed in 2 hours." Ms. Carter hesitated, then snapped a pen in half with sudden violence. "Because I've spent 15 years building this place. 15 years of quotas and corporate politics and," she caught herself, lowering her voice. "And you waltz in wearing sneakers and undo everything in an afternoon." Daniel expected anger, but Mr. Johnson just nodded. "You're right." Ms. Carter froze mid-breath. "This was your life's work," he continued. "And I came in like a wrecking ball." He leaned forward. "But tell me this, were you happy yesterday?" The dealership looked different at dawn. Daniel arrived an hour early, his stomach fluttering as he pushed through the glass doors. The showroom lights were still off, the luxury cars sleeping under dim security lighting. A single lamp burned in the office upstairs, Mr. Johnson's office now. A clang from the service bay made him jump. He followed the sound to find Tony already elbow-deep in an engine, coverall streaked with grease despite the early hour. "You always work this early?" Daniel asked. Tony didn't look up. "When the boss offers you a job you ain't qualified for?" "Yeah, you show up early." He wiped his hands. "Kid, tell me straight, am I crazy for considering this?" Daniel leaned against a tool cart. "I think crazy's the point. Yesterday morning, I was fetching coffee. Now I'm—" He waved vaguely. "Caught in a tornado," Tony finished. They shared a grin. Footsteps echoed. Mr. Johnson walked in holding 3 steaming cups. "Morning." He handed them out, black for Tony, cream and sugar for Daniel without asking. Tony sipped, then grimaced. "Christ, you make terrible coffee." Mr. Johnson smiled. "Good. You'll need to take over that too." The service phone rang shrilly. Tony reached for it, but Mr. Johnson intercepted. "Dealership service, this is Johnson." A woman's voice crackled through, frantic. "My husband's expedition broke down on Highway 9 with the kids. Your roadside said 2-hour wait, but—" "License plate and mile marker?" Mr. Johnson was already grabbing keys off the wall. 10 minutes later, the 3 of them were speeding down the highway in a dealership tow truck. Daniel clung to his seat as Tony took a curve too fast. "You always do roadside calls?" Daniel shouted over the engine. Mr. Johnson checked the GPS. "We do today." They found the stranded SUV on the shoulder, hazards blinking. A harried young mother stood outside with 3 toddlers clinging to her legs. Her face transformed when she saw the dealership logo. "Thank God. The baby's got asthma and we're out of." Tony was already popping the hood. "Alternators shot. Won't hold charge." Mr. Johnson knelt to eye level with the oldest child. "You like trucks, buddy?" The boy nodded, wide-eyed. "Good. You're riding shotgun with me." While Tony arranged the tow, Mr. Johnson drove the family to the hospital in the dealership's loaner car, Daniel following in the truck with the kids' car seats. At the hospital drop-off, the woman tried to press a 20 into Mr. Johnson's hand. "For gas at least." He closed her fingers around the bill. "Ma'am, you've paid us already by being our customer 6 years running." That Tahoe you bought in 19? Still gets serviced with us. Her mouth fell open. You remember that? Daniel watched something pass between them, the kind of loyalty no advertisement could buy. Back at the dealership, the morning staff had arrived to chaos. The receptionist gaped as they walked in. There's 12 messages for you. That family posted about us online and now. The phones were ringing off the hook. Tony stared at the madness, then at his grease-stained hands. I was happier when all I had to worry about was torque specs. Mr. Johnson clapped him on the shoulder. Welcome to management. By noon, every salesperson had taken at least 3 walk-in customers, unheard of for a Tuesday. David, the salesman from yesterday, moved through the showroom with quiet intensity, pausing only to give Daniel quick tips, never lead with price, and watch their eyes when they see the car they really want. During a lull, Daniel found Mr. Johnson in the parts room, counting inventory. You planned this, didn't you? Daniel gestured toward the bustling showroom. The rescue, the social media thing. Mr. Johnson noted a number on his clipboard. You give people what they need, sometimes you get what you want in return. He glanced up. But no, I didn't plan on delivering an asthmatic baby's inhaler before breakfast. A crash came from the service bay, followed by shouting. They arrived to find 2 mechanics in a shoving match over a misplaced impact wrench. Tony stepped between them effortlessly. Knock it off. We're a team now. The younger mechanic spat. Since when? Since the boss started buying us lunch every damn day, Tony shot back. Show some respect. The men separated, grumbling. Mr. Johnson watched, silent, until they'd dispersed. Then he turned to Tony. You handled that better than I would have. Tony mopped his forehead. Yeah, well, they listened to me because I've turned every bolt in this place. He hesitated. But we got a real problem, our parts suppliers jacking up prices next month. Mr. Johnson's expression darkened. How much? Enough to kill our profit margin. Daniel expected anger or panic. Instead, Mr. Johnson just nodded. Then we'll find new suppliers. Maybe even start our own parts line. He said it like commenting on the weather. Tony blinked. You're serious. Deadly. Mr. Johnson checked his watch. But first, we've got a press interview in 20 minutes about this morning's rescue. Daniel, you're up. Daniel's stomach dropped. Me? You were there. And the world needs to see this isn't just a one-man show. Mr. Johnson tossed him a tie. Look presentable. As Daniel fumbled with the knot, it hit him, this was the test. Not coffee fetching or paperwork, but standing in the spotlight when it mattered. The reporter arrived early, camera crew in tow. Daniel's mouth went dry. Mr. Johnson leaned in as they walked to meet her. Remember, it's not about selling cars. It's about serving people. The rest takes care of itself. The camera light blinked on. Daniel took a breath, and began to speak. The camera light burned hotter than Daniel expected. He blinked against it, acutely aware of the microphone clipped to his collar and the reporter's expectant stare. So, Daniel, the reporter smiled, what was going through your mind during this morning's rescue? Behind the camera, Mr. Johnson gave an almost imperceptible nod. Daniel swallowed. Honestly? That this family needed help more than we needed to check off some corporate customer service checklist. The words came easier as he spoke. Our job isn't just moving metal, it's keeping people moving. The reporter's eyebrows lifted. She hadn't expected poetry from a dealership employee. The interview lasted 15 minutes. Daniel talked about the highway rescue, Tony explained the mechanical issues, and Mr. Johnson deflected every question about himself back to the team. When the camera finally shut off, the reporter shook her head. I came for a feel-good viral story, she admitted. I think I got something bigger. As the crew packed up, David pulled Daniel aside. "You did good out there." His voice carried new respect. "But we've got a situation. 3 customers just walked in because of the news story, and 2 are asking for you by name." Daniel's stomach flip-flopped. "Me? Turns out people like buying cars from heroes." David smirked. "Don't screw it up." The next hours passed in a blur. Daniel, who'd never closed a single sale before, guided 2 families through purchases using everything he'd absorbed watching David. He forgot commission percentages, stammered through financing terms, and somehow, impossibly, both customers signed contracts. Mr. Johnson observed from a distance, intervening only when absolutely necessary. It wasn't until the last customer left that he approached Daniel, who was slumped at a desk, tie loosened, hands still shaking. "How much did I just cost us in discounts?" Daniel groaned. Mr. Johnson slid a bottle of water across the desk. "Less than we gained in lifetime customers. Those people will remember how you treated them long after they forget the price." A commotion at the entrance made them both turn. Ms. Carter stood in the doorway, her crisp blazer and determined stride a stark contrast to her emotional exit yesterday. The staff fell silent. She marched straight to Mr. Johnson. "I want my job back." No one breathed. Mr. Johnson didn't blink. "Why?" "Because you were right." Her voice didn't waver. "I forgot why I loved this business. Then I watched you all on the news today." She glanced around at the team, Tony in his grease-stained manager's shirt, David actually smiling, Daniel looking shell-shocked but proud. "This is the dealership I built. Just better." Mr. Johnson studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to Tony. "You're still service manager. But how would you feel about a co-pilot?" Tony shrugged. "Could use someone who speaks spreadsheet." The tension broke. Someone clapped. Ms. Carter's shoulders relaxed for the first time in years. Mr. Johnson checked his watch. "Good. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with." The front doors burst open. A silver-haired man in an expensive suit stormed in, flanked by 2 associates. The air left the room. Daniel didn't need introductions. Everyone in the auto business knew Richard Vance, the billionaire whose company had sold this dealership to Mr. Johnson. Vance's gaze swept the showroom before landing on Mr. Johnson. "You." His voice dripped ice. "A word. Now." They disappeared into the office. Through the glass walls, the team watched Vance jab a finger at the desk while Mr. Johnson remained still, listening. After 5 tense minutes, the billionaire stormed out just as abruptly as he'd arrived. Daniel intercepted Mr. Johnson as he exited. "What was that about?" Mr. Johnson's calm facade cracked just enough to show fatigue. "Turns out Vance expected me to be a silent partner. He's unhappy about today's developments." "How unhappy?" "Lawsuit unhappy." Mr. Johnson ran a hand over his face. "He claims our rescue stunt violated some non-compete clause about brand positioning." Tony barked a laugh. "Since when is saving kids bad for branding?" "Since it makes his other dealerships look bad by comparison." Mr. Johnson sighed. "He's giving me 24 hours to return to approved business operations or he'll force a buyback." Daniel felt sick. "Can he do that? With his lawyers?" "Maybe." Mr. Johnson straightened. "But this isn't over yet." He gathered the entire staff, sales, service, reception, in the showroom. For the first time since they'd met him, Mr. Johnson looked uncertain. "I won't lie to you," he began. "We're in a fight. Vance wants this place to go back to being just another profit center." He paused. "But I think we've proven it can be more than that." Ms. Carter surprised everyone by speaking first. "What do you need from us?" Mr. Johnson smiled faintly. Ideas. How do we prove this dealership is worth more than its bottom line? The suggestions came fast: community car care clinics, veteran discounts, free safety inspections for single parents. Daniel stayed quiet until the very end. What if, he said slowly, we made the customers our partners? All eyes turned to him. Daniel stood, ideas crystallizing. We invite every customer we've ever helped to tell their story. Not just about cars, about how this place impacted their lives. We collect them all and show Vance exactly what he's trying to buy back. The room buzzed. Mr. Johnson's eyes lit with something like pride. Then we'd better get started, he said. As the team dispersed into action, Daniel hesitated. You really think this will work? Mr. Johnson watched his employees, no, his team, spring into motion. Win or lose, this is already working. He clapped Daniel on the shoulder. Now let's go make some history. Daniel arrived before sunrise to find the service bay transformed. Workbenches now held laptops instead of tools, mechanics traded wrenches for phones, and a giant timeline covered one entire wall. Ms. Carter stood at the center of it all, barking orders like a general. She spotted Daniel and thrust a tablet into his hands. You're on customer testimonial duty. We've pulled every service record from the past decade, start calling. By noon, the stories poured in. A nurse who'd made it to her shift during the pandemic because the dealership stayed open just to fix her brakes. A struggling single father whose unexpected free oil change had brought him to tears. The elderly couple who still sent Christmas cards every year because a salesman had driven 50 miles to deliver their new car when the husband broke his hip. Daniel's fingers ached from typing. His eyes burned from screen glare. He'd never felt more alive. Mr. Johnson spent the morning locked in his office with lawyers, emerging only to ask Tony, how many free oil changes can we afford this quarter? Tony didn't hesitate. For at-risk seniors? All of them. At 3:17 p.m., the bomb dropped. A deliveryman brought a thick legal envelope. Vance had moved up his deadline. The buyback hearing would be at 5 p.m. today. The staff gathered in stunned silence as Mr. Johnson read the documents. Daniel expected anger, despair, anything but the slow smile that spread across his boss's face. He's scared, Mr. Johnson announced. Ms. Carter snatched the papers. This says he's litigious. No, this says we're winning. Mr. Johnson stood. Tony, prep the service van. Daniel, grab the presentation files. We're taking this fight to his doorstep. The Vance Enterprises tower loomed 30 stories of steel and glass. The lobby security guards stopped them at reception. Richard Vance doesn't see unscheduled visitors, the head guard said, eyeing their work clothes with disdain. Mr. Johnson set a flash drive on the counter. Tell him we brought the evidence he requested. 10 tense minutes later, they were escorted to a private elevator. The conference room at the top took Daniel's breath away, floor-to-ceiling city views, a table longer than their showroom, and Richard Vance seated at the head like a king. Vance didn't stand. I assume this is your surrender? Mr. Johnson plugged the flash drive into the wall display. This is our annual report. The screen came alive not with spreadsheets, but faces, dozens of them, a mosaic of every customer who'd sent testimonials. With a click, their stories began playing simultaneously, a chorus of gratitude that filled the opulent room with ordinary humanity. Vance's associates shifted uncomfortably. The billionaire himself remained stone-faced until one particular story played, a young voice saying, "When my dad died, the dealership gave my mom free tires so she could drive me to school." Daniel saw it, the slightest twitch in Vance's jaw. Mr. Johnson seized the moment. You built an empire selling transportation. We're selling trust. Which do you think lasts longer? Vance steepled his fingers. Sentiment doesn't pay property taxes. Neither do lawsuits. Mr. Johnson tossed a folder on the table. Our legal team found something interesting in the acquisition paperwork, a certain performance clause about community impact metrics you insisted on including. One of Vance's lawyers paled. Mr. Johnson continued, turns out we've exceeded those metrics by 300% this week alone. Sue us, and you're admitting your own contract is worthless. The room held its breath. Vance's glare could have melted steel. Then, abruptly, he laughed, a sharp, surprised sound. You're either the smartest bastard I've ever met, he said, or the luckiest. He stood, straightening his cuffs. Keep your damn dealership. But if quarterly profits dip below. They won't, Mr. Johnson interrupted. Because now we've got something your other stores don't. Vance paused at the door. And what's that? A soul. The billionaire left without another word, his lawyers scrambling after him. Back at the dealership, the team waited in nervous silence until Mr. Johnson gave a thumbs up through the glass doors. The cheer that erupted shook the showroom windows. That night, they celebrated with pizza in the service bay, sitting on oil drums and tool chests. Ms. Carter actually laughed at one of Tony's jokes. David taught Daniel the secret handshake the sales team had kept for years. Mr. Johnson stood apart, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. Daniel brought him a slice. Think Vance will really leave us alone now? Mr. Johnson took the pizza. For a while. Then there'll be another crisis, and another after that. He took a bite. But that's the job, waking up each day and deciding what matters more, numbers or people. Daniel looked around at their unlikely family, the reformed jerk salesman, the corporate warrior turned true believer, the gruff mechanic in a manager's chair. Think we can really keep this going? Mr. Johnson wiped grease off a wrench, his hands remembering old rhythms. We already are. The overhead lights flickered, Tony hitting the master switch. All right, kids, party's over. We open in 8 hours. As they walked out into the parking lot, the first drops of rain began to fall. Mr. Johnson paused, looking back at the building, its sign gleaming wet under the streetlights. Coming, Daniel? Daniel took one last look at the place that had changed his life in a week. Then he jogged to catch up, ready for whatever came next.